Perfect. We're just waiting for everybody to come in. So let's give it maybe a minute or so. And then we get started. Perfect. Just now. All right. I think we can get going while there are more attendees joining. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this online discussion on fisheries, transparency, and small island developing states. My name is Sven Biermann. I'm the Executive Director of the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, and you have not seen my face on the flyer, and the reason for that is because I'm going to make it very brief and just a few introductory remarks. The Fisheries Transparency Initiative, as you probably know, the main job of what we do is to support coastal countries in increasing public access to fisheries information held by governments. And we're already working with a number of countries, including 3 small island developing states, which are Cabo Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, and also the Seychelles. But what we also do is to try to increase the understanding of what transparency in fisheries actually means, also recognizing the complexity of a simple word like transparency when you actually go further down into the details. So one of the things we're doing is we're publishing regularly so-called transparency briefings, or what we call T-briefs. And in these T-briefs, we're going into depth on certain aspects such as beneficial ownership, the importance of information for small-scale fisheries, but also in our recent T-brief, the situation on transparency for small island developing states. And this is what this webinar or online discussion is really all about. So from my side, just a few logistical remarks. As you've seen on the flyer, and as you see on the bottom of your screen, there is interpretation available. We will conduct the discussion mostly in English, but there is simultaneous translation for Portuguese, French, and Spanish. So if you want to listen to that, please select the relevant audio channel. I also recommend that you select mute the original speaker so that you just hear the voice of the interpretation. We will record this session so that those who cannot join us now can watch it later at a later point in time. And last point, you see there is a Q&A button on your screen. Use it if you have any questions that you want to raise about this topic that you want to bring into the discussion. We are mindful of everyone's time. Everyone is extremely busy. So we set ourselves the goal of keeping this a very interesting, but also a time-efficient discussion for 1 hour. So we will try to answer some of the questions that you have throughout the sessions, and some of the questions will be answered at the end when our moderator will open it up to the Q&A. So with this, I hand it over to Andre, who is not only the moderator for this session, but also the lead author for all our transparency briefings. So Andre, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sven. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, so today we're going to try and cover a very complicated subject in a short amount of time. We've narrowed down our discussion to a few key themes, but the general theme we're talking about is whether there are unique challenges or opportunities for democratic governance of fisheries, transparency of fisheries in small island developing states. And I think it's important to reflect at the beginning why this publication happened, what was the motivation behind it. And I think there are a number of issues that drove the FiTI to doing something specific on small island developing states. First of all, clearly for a lot of small island developing states, fisheries is extremely important to the people there, the citizens. It's, you know, tends to have higher per capita consumption of fish than anywhere else in the world. Fisheries is an important part of the economy, the culture, food security. So for a global fisheries initiative, small island developing states are particularly important. Secondly, when we were doing the research, I was really, fascinated to find out just how important SIDS are in terms of managing such large areas of our oceans. They may be very small in population, but they cover, I think, over 30% of the exclusive economic zones of the blue planet. And that, of course, for some people challenges the very notion of what a small island developing state is. And there's a lot of interest in rebranding SIDS as big ocean states, which I think is, quite convincing and a valid way of changing our perception about these diverse countries. There's also, I think, growing attention on small island developing states or big ocean states over the past decade or so. I think there's increasing awareness of their vulnerabilities, particularly to the climate disaster, also their economic vulnerabilities, and particularly their high levels of debt distress. So I think globally, there's increasing international attention to small island developing states. And then finally, for us, we have done some research on levels of transparency in different countries, and we've kind of found that some of the small island developing states are not performing particularly well. So we think that there's an opportunity to make good improvements. So that's the context of why we did this research. And I hope if you haven't looked at the brief, you can do so. But I want to kick off by asking our panelists just to first of all introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about them, about their work. I can say from the outset that none of them self-identify as fisheries specialists. So we're not going to be dwelling too much on, testing their knowledge of fisheries in small island developing states. We're going to just say a little bit about that at the beginning, but we have got a really rich panel of people with experience on governance issues, democracy, political rights, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. So maybe, Angelique, you could start by introducing yourself.
Thank you very much, Andre, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. So just by way of introduction, my name is Angelique Pouponneau. I'm an advisor to the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. AOSIS is what you'll hear me frequently refer to it. It is an alliance of 39 states that come together because of our similar circumstances and contexts and engage in international negotiations in particular, but international advocacy to ensure that SIDS are adequately represented internationally. Thanks.
Yuan Barry, please.
Yep. Good day, good morning, good afternoon to colleagues joining in online. My name is International in Papua New Guinea. I'm with the national chapter of the Global Transparency Movement. I've been working in the spaces introduced by Andre in terms of governance more in the southern fisheries, but Transparency International Papua New Guinea has operated as a civil society member of groups such as the Open Government Partnership, the Extractive Ministries Transparency Initiative, and other fora that look at how multi-stakeholder approaches to transparency and good governance can inclusively allow citizens to engage with the government for development. Fundamentally, our work is through transparency to address our member countries implementing within the movement of transparency international. So looking forward to this discussion and speaking to those points.
Excellent. Yeah, before we went on air, we were just chatting about the definition of a small island as developing states and Papua New Guinea being included. It's quite a large country, and whether that is an issue in how we conceptualize the subject. Bernice, our Spanish speaker, so over to you. Can you introduce yourself?
Muy buenos días a todos. Gracias a la iniciativa de Transparencia Pesquera por hacernos la invitación de participar en este webinar. Mi nombre es Berenice Barinas. Yo soy la directora ejecutiva de la Dirección General de Ética e Integridad Gubernamental de la República Dominicana. Esta dirección general es el órgano rector en materia de acceso a la información pública, transparencia, gobierno abierto, conflicto de interés y prevención de la corrupción administrativa. Creo que esta conversación esta mañana va a ser sumamente interesante, sobre todo por tratar estos aspectos que tienen que ver con la gobernanza, de la transparencia y el acceso a la información pública en este tema tan importante para todos nosotros, las islas. Muchas gracias.
Excellent. I hope the translation is working well for everyone. So let's kick it off. Angelique, you have the difficult start to maybe reflect on what we wrote about the importance of fisheries for small island developing states. I believe you come from Seychelles. It's your home. That's the home of the FiTI as well. And I've spent some time there and I experienced just how important fish is to your culture, diet. Is it something that you think is common across small island developing states?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Andre. And I think you allude to it in the tea brief, but I'm certainly in the camp of not too many generalizations, and that there's an importance in appreciating the differences that do exist within small island developing states. So to your question about the importance of marine fisheries to societies, to small island developing states, I think it really depends on the SIDS. And I do have to say at this juncture, and being a lawyer, sort of put on my caveats before I continue, that AOSIS does not coordinate on issues of fisheries. And that's very important for me to say that, I'm not speaking on behalf of AOSIS and its members. But just to go directly to your question about its importance, it very much depends on this expanse of ocean that many SIDS, not all, but many SIDS do have when it comes to their exclusive economic zone. And we have heard this narrative emerge about big ocean states, or bosses, as many people like to refer to it. The likes of Ambassador Jumeau likes to refer to when he speaks internationally. And these oceans are oftentimes quite resource rich in terms of fisheries and other living resources. And of course, by virtue of that, it does mean that fisheries, amongst other things like tourism, the base of the economy becomes very marine focused. And I think it is a matter of food, it is a matter of culture, it is a matter of recreation, and it is a matter of economic society. It really does revolve around the ocean and, of course, the resources and living things that lie within, and the ecosystems there. And as you mentioned, I'm from the Seychelles, and I always like to put things into perspective when we think of small island developing states or bosses. It's a country of about 100,000 people, and we are the custodians of a marine area of 1.35 million kilometers square. Context for you, that is about the size, I believe, and we can always fact check this, but the size of France and Germany combined, 100,000 people. And I think that is really the basis of how many SIDS have developed in terms of their economies. But there are things that are changing in terms of the importance of marine fisheries to SIDS. We're very conscious of things like climate change, where we've seen a lot of marine habitats and ecosystems being affected negatively. And of course, habitats, ecosystems, coral reefs, especially reef fish, their habitats are being destroyed. And of course, that may mean certain migration of certain species. And we saw this very clearly. And I think this year we may see a lot of it, given it's been pronounced an El Nino year, where tuna, a pelagic species, are also moving to cooler waters because of changes in water temperature. So so that's climate change. And then we obviously have the issue of globalization. That is a phenomenon that continues to strengthen around the world, where there has been a lot of importation of other sources of protein. This is being eaten more frequently than our usual diet, our more cultural diet. Now fish is more twice a week rather than 5 times a week. And, on the weekends you have some chicken and some other protein source. So those things are changing. But it also means that there are consequences as a result of that. And many of them are social implications. We're getting more imported foods. There's been an increase in non-communicable diseases such as obesity, diabetes. We're really being affected by things that our great-great-grandparents weren't as affected by. And this is very much tied to a lot of the way in which our relationship with fisheries is changing. That said, I can't leave it on a negative note. The positive is it does propel people to start thinking about sustainable management, the prospects of aquaculture and new opportunities that may exist, sustainable aquaculture and the new opportunities that may exist in this sector. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, no, you've covered a lot of really interesting points there. And I think some of those points we tried to discuss as well in our paper. And we put together this table showing just how expansive the EA's exclusive economic zones of SIDS are in comparison to the population size. But I think also this theme of how things are changing, particularly around diets, food security, and the diminishing role in many small island states of fish for food and the health consequences. I think another topic which is really important is the marine spaces around small island developing states are increasingly, there's increasing attention to develop them further through perhaps this blue economy concept. And I think for people who are interested in fisheries, particularly small-scale fisheries, one of the importance of transparency is that these spaces are going to become more competitive, and the rights of coastal communities who might not be so wealthy or well represented can be threatened by the blue economy development. And in that context, transparency around fisheries is really important to help raise the visibility of the importance of fisheries, because fisheries is often quite neglected in national policy debates. It's seen as a small contribution to economic development, but actually its value lies in other spheres. My other panelists, we're going to move towards discussing some of the issues around governance, but did you want to contribute anything further to the fisheries debate, how important they are, some of the themes, or do you feel that Angelique has done an excellent job in setting ourselves up for the other discussions?
I think just to add on the SIDS point, that the definitions, while tricky, I think the approach is useful because it allows for practitioners to employ similar practices that are applicable. And so that's the utility of the definition. And so while the scale or the location or the development standards in countries might be different, we're kind of, we share common challenges. And so the solutions that we look at are also similarly focused. So it's useful in that sense as a practitioner to have these definitions beyond just development studies. It actually assists with the advocacy work that one would want to undertake in communities and across different regions.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. That actually takes us nicely to the second theme, which is probably the most complicated. And it's something we tried to cover in the brief. And it's really about whether we can generalize at all about the governance, the democratic governance challenges of small island developing states. And I think the simple answer to that is no. There's so much diversity amongst the countries that are self-identify as small island developing states that generalizations are not very helpful. Also, some of the attributes that are given to small island developing states, such as their vulnerability to debt, their small sectors, having economies which depend on very specific sectors. Well, you could say the same thing about other developing countries. But then again, there is so much literature that teases out certain unique trends and observations in small island developing states, particularly the smaller small island developing states. And I think for many of us who are not familiar with small island states or big ocean states, it's very hard for us to appreciate just what it must be like to live in a society that is so small. Many of the, I think at least 20 of the small island developing states, Angelique and Oasis, have populations of less than 500,000 people. And some of those even smaller. And that's smaller than many European towns or American towns. And for a country to exist in such a micro state, it must have some impacts on democracy and the politics. Now, there's a lot of literature that explores that, and some say there are very positive elements of living in a small island developing states for democracy. Others are more critical, saying that, you know, in very small states, you have a very personalized system of governance, and it can be quite vulnerable to clientelism, conflicts of interest. It's also very expensive for small island developing states to run a country. They tend to spend more on public services per capita than any other country in the world, you know, those groups of small island states. They also tend to have very large public sectors compared to other countries. So the government employs more people and spends more on providing public services. And to go back to Seychelles, we give an example. Seychelles, I think, had 14 or 15 ministries, and those ministries have got to do so much and meet in international meetings, report on things, but there's only 100,000 people to draw on. So there are perhaps some unique challenges to small island developing states. But let me hand it over to Bernice. And I wanted you to reflect on your perspective on whether it's possible to generalize about democratic challenges or benefits of small island developing states. And if so, you know, what might they be? And perhaps also this common allegation that small island states are quite vulnerable to clientelism. What's your view on that? I don't know if we're waiting for the translator to catch up. Bernice, can you hear us?
Muy buenos días.
Okay. Good morning, Andre. Good morning to all those who are here. This theme is very interesting. The fisheries contribute is a great activity of a great economic importance, important for the food, importance for environment. It is important. It represents some 93 tons of products every month. So you have to pay attention. In the case of the Dominican Republic, that is one island. So we have some coastal regions, some have the harbors where the activities are developing in different. The transparency is something very, very important, and I do believe that we should take care of it in a global perspective. I think to share that the Dominican Republic, in this moment, we have some rules. We have the law 30704, and in this law, there is a condition. There is the Dominican Council, in the Dominican Council for Fisheries, that we rule what is the fisheries research, what are the moment of fisheries to rule all the governance. So there is this council that's composed by the shareholder, the actors that participate. There is the agriculture office, the tourism. So there are the companies that are in this council, the National Council of Fisheries Production. They are centers of research that work. So it's so this according to this council, we really everything that has to see with the license for transparency. So we have the Fisheries Initiative. There's some information. So the license regulation, the register of the vessels, the license authorization with this council. In the Dominican Republic, we real all these themes that we are talking about. So for the second part of conversation, so the information access is vital, is very important. Information of quality is important. So we've been advancing with the availability of public information to inform the governments. We are facilitators. So with the regulation, we give we have to develop all the sectors. We have with the open information we can achieve. We give the added value to the sectors. So I am going to listen to my other colleagues on this subject.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
More of an expert on fisheries than you led us to believe. But that highlighted a few interesting points for me. One of the challenges for transparency organizations, and it's something that we talk about a lot in FiTI and with other organizations, is that there's one thing making information available online, governments publishing things like information on who they're licensing, how much fish vessels are catching. But once that information's out and we can get governments to organize and publish information that they may not have been publishing, there's this expectation that the public will read that information, use it, hold their governments accountable, highlight weaknesses and problems. Whereas actually, in many countries, the assumption is that there is a civil society, there is a media that can do that. And actually, they don't exist, or they're very weak. They may well not feel able to criticize governments. They may not want to be critical. They may be concerned about their safety. And it's something that, we discuss in the tea brief about some of the literature around the weakness of civil society in small island developing states, or the challenges. Also, issues around the strength of the media. There's quite a lot of very interesting reports in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, I think less so in African small island developing states, but kind of reports that are concerned about the independence of the media. The role of government in media is very heavy in a lot of small island developing states. So what does that mean for a transparency initiative? We're going to try and get information to the public, and then what? So maybe Barry, you could give us your perspectives on this. Do you think it's true that civil society and the media in say Pacific small island states that you're aware of, are they weak? Are there improvements? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think you've really identified the issue. There's a lot of expectation that's placed on civil society to carry that burden of accountability in small island developing states. I think the Pacific has been lucky in that globally we've performed quite well in terms of those civic rights, the ability to assemble or to protest. Free Media Index often ranks Pacific Island countries relatively high, globally speaking. That said, in the region, we've seen increasing restrictions on civil freedoms, particularly in the digital space, the ability for citizens to express themselves freely digitally, but also to assemble and protest, to freely associate and express themselves in the communities has also become more difficult. We find that the media freedoms, I think it's highlighted in the debrief from FiTI, is in the Pacific. What we see in the examples you had in the briefing paper on Fiji, for instance, we had a change in government in Fiji just recently. And so the brief is slightly outdated in that the media policy that was in place prior in the previous government has now been repealed by the new incoming government in Fiji because of the recent elections. And so media freedoms in Fiji seem to be improving. But then conversely, in Papua New Guinea, for instance, the government is seeking to implement Fiji-like policies from the previous government. And so the government that came in from the last elections is the same as the previous government. So to the extent that an indicator for democracy and the ability for civil society to have an impact, electoral outcomes also play a huge impact on the ability of civil society to participate and for governments to have mandate. If you have a small island developing state, for journalists, it becomes difficult to report because you don't have the same amount of protections, or even for whistleblowers, for instance, you're easily identified in a small island developing state. So those pressures are much more felt in that space, and it really is an unreasonable burden on civil society to have to explain such technical data and to be able to do it constantly and with governments that become more repressive. And I think that's similar across other regions as well as the Pacific.
But just to follow up on that, I mean, again, as Angelique warned us at the beginning, generalizations that can be really inappropriate. But do you feel, let's say in the Pacific area that you're familiar with, are the trends getting worse in terms of human rights and political rights? Or is it, and if so, do you feel there are any reasons for that? And I'm particularly interested in, the climate emergency and the debt distress, and whether these things are having a negative impact on the way governments operate. They're in a constant state of crisis or a narrative of crisis, and whether that negatively impacts on political rights. Is that anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I touched on the elections, and it's really the democratic mandate. Again, I can speak from Papua New Guinea experience, which is a bit of an outlier, but the conduct of actual effective elections has a huge impact on whether a country is able to actually engage citizens meaningfully, because that's the accountability mechanism that if a government doesn't perform, the citizens are able to vote them out. And so in the Pacific, there have been issues with government transitions during elections. And we've had, for instance, foreign actors influencing the outcome of elections. So in the Solomon Islands, they've deferred their national elections because of state activities, in this case, the Pacific Regional Games, which is being bankrolled by the American government. And in some of the provinces of the Solomon Islands, Chinese government is also funding activities. So we see these influences in the democratic machinery then coming to the fore when you have processes like transparency on fisheries or other extractive sector. It makes it difficult for civil society to engage if the governments are less democratic, because they're less inclined to have a healthy civil society or a free media. And so to your question about whether things are worsening, the context for free democracies globally is weakening. And in Pacific, because we've had such strong media freedoms and so previously, it's perceptible because we have less capable citizens speaking out and less capable journalists speaking out about issues domestically within the Pacific. I can't speak for the other regions in the globe, but that's the feeling that we had a space that we could discuss previously, but it's become more difficult to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, as you say, it's a global phenomena, the shrinking space for civil society and kind of problems of civic engagement. Angelique, would you like to add something?
Yeah, thanks for that. And really, I concur with a lot that's been said. And I just wanted to highlight a really interesting, they call it it's a theory, but there's a professor Baldacchino, and he says that people from small island developing states have something called a might syndrome, and M for monopoly, I for intimacy, T for totality, E for emigration, if you can't deal with M, I, and T. And I'll just touch on totality. And it really talks about how close we are to governments and how much we feel governments influence our day-to-day life prospects, life opportunities, and chances. And because of that closeness, I mean, really, your member of parliament is 2 calls away, at least 2 calls away. You can get access to people, which is positive. But at the same time, it does mean that people feel, whether it is, you know, a feeling or it is a fact, people feel that governments are able to really influence and affect how their lives sort of play out, whether it is job opportunities that they get later on, whether it is other opportunities that they get access to, or whatever it is. And, you know, because the society is still small, there's the ability to either move things very quickly or make sure things don't move very quickly. But it really makes us question, as you know, as our colleague from PNG was speaking, it really makes you question whether, and this I now turn to, there are similarities with SIDS, whether the theory of change when it comes to transparency is applicable to everyone, and whether there needs to be something a specific approach, a unique approach, an approach that works for SIDS when we start thinking about transparency. And I totally agree that given the context, placing the entire responsibility on civil society, because of course, it compounds the issue. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you have a civil society activist or a journalist who goes up against government, they then feel that their life chances will be affected. They then emigrate. There are fewer people inside the country, capacity constraint. The vicious cycle goes on. So it really makes us think about whether there needs to be a different theory of change. You know, of course, I think the importance of transparency and what it leads to is important, but then how do we get there may need to be different in the context of SIDS and its societal uniqueness that we need to take into consideration. Do I have an answer of what that looks like? No, but I think it's definitely worth some more thought. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Angelique. I mean, I think in the conclusion of the tea brief, I headed in that direction and was questioning whether this traditional idea of transparency, which is quite confrontational, I think, and Transparency International probably reflected on that it's set up to be, we're going to publish information and people are going to hold their governments account and expose corruption and illegal fishing or these sorts of things. And I think a lot of people involved in the FiTI don't really want to go in that direction. And I think SIDS are a good example of why that might be inappropriate. And it's far more interesting to look at how transparency can bring people together to talk about policy coherence, about how fisheries are managed and whether they're being managed optimally. What are the difficulties involved in fisheries and to be kind of less confrontational with transparency. But that may also come with problems. So we don't have any answers either. But I think your point about the way transparency and open government is framed needs to be sensitive to the context. But I would say that that's the same everywhere. It's not just in small island states as well. I'm going to now talk a little bit about, you know, this transparency and open government initiatives in general. And I wanted to ask Bernice a question. It actually reflects a question that someone in the audience has posted. And it's about the Caribbean countries and their progress with the Open Government Partnership. Dominican Republic is a member of the Open Government Partnership. Am I correct, Dominique? I believe someone has told me. Sorry, Bernice. But I believe very few other Caribbean countries have done so. And why? Maybe you could explain why that's the case. Why did Dominican Republic join the Open Government Partnership and not other Caribbean countries?
Si escuché bien, porque hay un poco de interferencia, hablas de la Alianza para el Gobierno Abierto, André.
I don't know if I understood it because there was some noise.
No te escuché bien. Bueno, la República Dominicana forma parte de la Alianza para el Gobierno Abierto.
I didn't hear very well, but what I know that the Dominican Republic is a part of this, where the countries, where the government are transparent. When we talk about communication, that we are able to take this communication, to put this communication on the table, all these themes that are so important and so important. I do believe that all the countries, we should start to work to try to build the mechanisms necessary to that all these sectors that have so impact, that has the impact of these fisheries, that they have all the necessary instruments to have access to information. In general, the laws of access to information, you have a basic theme, that information that has to be available, that has to be with the public activities and all this relation, the transparency. When we talk what the public institutions do, but they don't, sometimes we don't have access to, we have to open the channels that all the stakeholders, all the actors can ask for this information. When I say to request information, I don't say only to request information in all the different institutions, to request the availability, to have availability, the information that doesn't exist, that the government may be available, have an open channel that information can be used and reused. So not only this is a practice we are doing now, the national politics of open data. We have a kind of we want the means of communication can make use of information that is available. They can ask in these open channels, so they can prepare news, they can prepare research, and the best research have receive their prize for the best research every year. So with the use of all the open data. So the other side, Andre, I don't know if you remember, I talk. You remember that in the beginning I talked about we have a lot of coastal regions that we are doing now. We want to impact the life of the production sectors. We had an engagement of open government. We have transparency in the governance. So in these coastal regions, they are going to have impact in this project, or the sector that are interested in the communication, that is an added value to their development. So all that use the information of a public quality. So you publish public information that are necessary. I don't know if I understood well your question. If not, you can ask again.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bernice. I think you covered a lot of you provided us a lot of information and some really good points. I think the wider issue is, what are in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific, what are the reasons really stopping the advance of open government? And I want to maybe ask Yambari your perspective on this. I mean, is it fair to say that small island states, including in the Pacific, are lagging behind in terms of these open government commitments? which I also think are, some of them can be questionable in terms of their importance. I know I don't want to pretend that they are, simple solutions, but is it true? Would you see that the open government wave is less pronounced in small island states? And I think as a follow-up to that, whether you feel that other forms of communication, as Angelique was saying, are sometimes more relevant to people than what international donors, international organizations are asking. Before you answer that, I believe Angelique had to dash off to another meeting. She's a very busy schedule. She's in New York, and this was an early morning for her. So if we've lost her, I'll say thank you for joining us, but sorry we didn't get to say goodbye, but really appreciated her time. But so back to the topic, your reflections on this kind of open government wave in small island developing states. Yeah, I'm very...
Yeah, I think I was just listening to Bernie's answer, and I think the experience between Papua New Guinea and Dominican Republic is similar in that we entered the open government partnership really to look at access to information and open data, amongst other things. For Papua New Guinea, we started in 2014, and for Transparency International Papua New Guinea, we've been the civil society co-chair to that open government process since then. We co-chaired the process, and we were mindful, I think, to your earlier point about the perception that because we participated, it might be seen as an anti-corruption mechanism rather than more of a service delivery or even just a democratic effort. And so that's what we've been trying to stress in the open government space. I think to your question about its impact within small island developing states, I can only speak to Papua New Guinea. I think in the Pacific, the only other countries that implement OGP or members of the OGP are really Australia and New Zealand. The other smaller states haven't engaged on the OGP process. I think globally, the open government partnership started off quite strongly. It was championed by then President Barack Obama and a number of the intervening years. Those voices have maybe changed, or they've found new priorities in terms of the global landscape. And so the focus on the open government partnership as a key driver for democratic reforms through civil society engagement has been globally less viral as it was previously. I say that because also the US was championing the efforts, have now come up with a parallel process of summits for democracy, where they also have commitments and governments coming and speaking about what they can do to promote democracy again through openness and through engagement of citizens. What we've seen is that the open government landscape has adapted, where it's been, adapted by the local country. It's adapted itself to fit within the local mechanisms. But where they didn't take root as strongly, it's kind of floundered, and it's waiting for either more global attention or more strategic thinking in terms of its implementation. So for instance, in Papua New Guinea, the Open Government Partnership has released 2 national action plans. We're still yet to implement, for instance, the access to information legislation that the government committed to in the 2018 action plan. And so the purpose of joining the OGP still has yet to be realized. It has led to conversations and led to work and development, but the actual hasn't arrived. And then to your question about whether actually having access to information digitally is sufficient in small island developing states, I think is a pertinent one. It's difficult to tell what the most critical information is. There's data sets that a government might put out that might comply with international requirements, but people want basic information about, access to primary healthcare or education services. And often that means in the local community being able to see someone and speak to someone. And if the government puts it online and digitizes, it makes it, even more difficult, because then the government says it's fulfilled its obligation without citizens actually being able to see the impact of that obligation or the intent of that obligation being met. I think just to also draw on the other openness kind of reform that's taken place and is prominent in this space is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, and FiTI obviously has similar approaches to the EITI process, but within a sector. And my organization, Transparency International PNG, also leads within that space, within a cohort of civil society organizations, trying to support the government and private sector in disclosing the amounts that are paid to the state and received by the state from the extractive sector, specifically within mining and oil and gas. And that challenge has been the one that we discussed earlier, where because there's an economic impact to EITI implementation, implementing states are more likely to comply with the standard. And so to access financial markets, you need to show, or if you have international, multinational companies operating, they look at the EITI compliance within a country. And it also impacts other financial considerations for the government. And so those incentives, are leverage that civil society can use to engage with government on the EITI process. And that's something the Open Government Partnership lacks. And so you see a difference in terms of when there's lack of political support for the Open Government Partnership, it kind of wanes. But because of the economic interest in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, it sustains cycles of political interest. So that's just maybe my personal reflections based on the implementation of these open government reforms in Papua New Guinea.
No, that's really interesting. And I think fisheries is gaining more geopolitical interest, particularly in the Pacific, given large tuna fisheries, the big amount of investments that are involved. So it shares some similarities with other extractive industries. Going back to the Caribbean, Bernice, the Caribbean has very strong legislation now at a regional level on access to information, access to participation, and access to justice on environmental matters. And this is, I'm referring to the Esquazu Agreement. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's modeled on the Aarhus Convention that the European Union and member states developed in about 20 years ago. And I think the Convention for Caribbean and South America was passed about 2 or 3 years ago. And it's very strong legislation, which in theory gives citizens the right to access information on environmental matters. Whereas the Pacific, I don't think, has such strong legislation on the right to access to information. Do you think for fisheries, Bernice, do you think it's something that is important for us? Is it something you engage with, the access to information legislation at a regional level? Are we getting a translation here? Seems to be a very long delay. I have a question whilst we're waiting for the translation from Thomas Walsh. And just to let everyone know, we have 5 minutes left. So please send us some questions if you wanted to contribute to the discussion or thoughts. I'm looking at the Q&A, the webinar chat. So Thomas was asking about what are the role of foreign partners in their fisheries access agreements in trying to push for transparency in small island developing states? Yes, it's something that is relevant to aspects. Not all of the small island developing states have fisheries agreements with foreign distant water fishing nations, particularly in the Caribbean. But I think the European Union has been saying it wants to promote transparency with countries that it signs fishing access agreements with, but it's not necessarily a comprehensive approach to transparency, and they're not always successful. China is also another important distant water fishing nation, and so far the evidence that China is promoting transparency in fisheries is quite hard to find. That's not to say that other nations as well, such as Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, they're also not necessarily champions of transparency yet, but I think there's more and more interest. And the European Union is certainly making more sounds. They want to insert clauses in their fishing agreements which oblige host countries to share data, share information, and I think with the public now. So things are improving a little bit. Any other questions? Bernice, did you hear my last question about the Esquazu agreement on access to information? No, maybe not. I think I'm going to have to pass on that. So does anyone have any more questions for our panelists? And as a kind of concluding question, I wanted to put the panelists now down to two, just to give us a couple of advice, we'll give FiTI some advice on how to develop transparency in fisheries, what the approach could be for the small island developing states. Yambari, we were talking about this earlier, and perhaps this idea of not approaching it as an anti-corruption, as a confrontational approach. I think being wary of the capacities. I think we did have a question earlier about, civil society, whether they lack training in interpreting data on fisheries. So it's got to be, I think transparency has got to be very much a partnership based on participation rather than kind of confrontation of using data to hold your governments accountable. Was that something you would advise to fisheries people working on transparency?
Yeah, I think the points that I spoke about are really the key advice I would have. Like, it's being mindful of global political interest, domestic electoral cycles, and that kind of space of operating, whether there's any financial or access to financial markets that might, impact a country that incentivizes its participation in these kind of transparency compacts. I note from one of the questions from Pedro in the Q&A about the overall lack of training and technical assistance to stakeholders. I think that's always an issue, but it's really not just the stakeholders in terms of whether I'm in civil society or the media. It's really a broader civic understanding of tax bases and natural resource ownership, civic rights, and the interplay of that. So it's really a larger national discourse, I find. If you have that kind of engagement, that makes everything less applicable in terms of generalization, because it's all about context, the different democratic spaces that each country has and the opportunities for actors to use them. And so yes, there is a lack of maybe training and technical assistance, but stakeholders can only do so much, because there has to be a public demand and consumption. And really, for small island developing states, the impact is whether people's lives are changed by the agreements that are entered to by the governments, and whether that more public funds, internal revenue collection, and service delivery. That's where people see the impact of these kind of initiatives. So while useful and position papers might be worthwhile, in the end, if people's lives are not impacted, then the governments are not particularly keen, apart from ticking a box to access financial markets, and citizens are not demanding for this kind of processes, because it seems to be a process that's removed from their immediate lives and livelihoods. So it's about that kind of practical grounding, but more power to openness and looking at adapting and being able to ride out the waves of interest and applicability globally. And these kind of forums and research papers allow us through categories like SIDS or BOSS. I like the term BOSS. Something I've learned through this panel session. I think I'll use it more frequently in my discussions. But these kind of scenarios in different jurisdictions is helpful in that regard, because it then allows us to look at approaches that we can implement domestically. So yeah, I think the advice is more of the same, but more local and more impactful.
Yeah, I think that's very, very wise. And I think we've come to the end of our session, and it's been really interesting. We've just touched on things which I think are so fascinating and deserve more time. And I really enjoyed putting the tea brief together, and I learned a lot in doing it. And I hope there's going to be more opportunities to work with governments and civil society in small island developing states on fisheries issues, fisheries transparency. I think it's important for many reasons, and not just for trying to catch out governments for doing bad things. I think that's far too superficial a way of looking at it. I think there's really interesting and important policy issues that transparency can support, particularly around the rights of small-scale fishers, coastal communities, the future of food security given the climate disaster. These are the issues I think we should be building transparency around. So on that, I'm going to say thank you so much, Angelique. She had to dash off. Bernice, you know, I think we had problems with the translation, but it was fascinating listening to you and fantastic to meet you. And likewise, Yuan Bari, thank you so much for your time. Over to Sven, I think, to say goodbye.
I'll do, but I'm not going to do that without saying thank you to you, Andre, for a very skillful moderation. Berenice, we will reach out to you because I think what the Dominican Republic is doing with regards to open government and the leadership that you're providing in the region, I think it's together with Jamaica, is really inspiring, and we need to see more. And that question, why are not more countries doing what you guys are doing, is really important. So we need to have some follow-ups with that. Yuambari, the same, you know, the FiTI is not active yet in the Pacific. Hopefully Papua New Guinea can be the trailblazer in the region and the door opener. So again, we will follow up on that. So thank you everyone for joining. This session has been recorded. We will upload it tomorrow on the FiTI YouTube channel so you can have a look at this. I also would like to thank Irish Aid for supporting FiTI on the work with small island developing states, in particular in Africa. And with this being German and being just a little bit over time, I would thank you again, and everyone have a fantastic day. So have a great day. Thank you.